Hello, this is Matthew from Warrior Pilgrim, and today we're going to be talking about an interesting term used constantly in various arguments when people seem to be unwilling to accept different perspectives. I'm of course talking about mental gymnastics. I can't really do genuine gymnastics here in this room to demonstrate the point, but I can use another method. But first, what is the definition of mental gymnastics? Well, a simple search also brings up the term intellectual gymnastics, which is defined as trying to dazzle or confuse people with clever-sounding sophistry in order to hide flawed logic or poor evidence, and is often used by people in order to blame anyone but themselves. So they can be used by narcissists as well. So, I feel that term gets thrown around way too much, especially when arguments crop up, where a simple adjustment of perspective is all that's required. So how do we do that? Well, first we need to address what we are looking at, which will be being on point. We're using this as an analogue. So if I line up on here, that means I'm on point from there. You've got a point, you're aiming at me. When you make the attack, that's me having to deal with it. If I have my own weapon, like my analogue spear here, then I'll need to get you on point as well. Now, there are several ways we can deal with that. I can simply knock the point aside, simply showing it was a bad point and addressing it directly. What some people do is simply ignore that and try to counter-thrust, make a point which is exactly the same, but simply correcting it, without even bearing in mind that they're not defending themselves, they're simply attacking dead straight. You find that in both atheist and theist arguments on both sides of the pond, because I've certainly had one atheist just lay into me when I carefully addressed all of his points, and he just decided he didn't want to lose the argument, even though he already had, essentially. I refer to those people as berserker in Lorica. And then you can simply avoid the point. That is, getting completely out of the way and striking in a different manner. That again doesn't really address the point, and more often than not, there are other people around trying to line up your point. That's the point you have to address first of all. So, can someone be accused of mental gymnastics in that case? Well, there's a concept in HEMA swordsmanship called little is enough is plenty. It's primarily in the early rapier manuals, where you're simply making tiny adjustments to the opponent's weapon. So here, all I'm doing is simply shifting their point offline. I'm stepping off very slightly, so if they do continue the thrust, they'll just go right past me, but I'm still on point with them. Now I can extend. But that's assuming their point is wrong or invalid. But sometimes you still need to require to address it. How? Well, let me just grab some tools to demonstrate. Firstly will be my shield analogue, my simple staff. And the next will be my Roman gladius. I have a feeling this is either a Pompey or a Hispaniensis, but I have yet to do the research on that. Either way, this will be a scutum shield, though I'll be using the spine of it to adjust the point. If I extend this now, what I'll do is square up. The opponent will make a thrust. What I'll do is simply address the point, I acknowledge the point, address it, adjust my position, and make my own point. Is there anything else I can do with that? Well, many people would say that mental gymnastics, well, when I think of mental gymnastics, I think of the flourishing movements that are sort of stereotypical of Jedi and, of course, all manner of fantasy sword working fantasy films. The Witcher is a classic example. So if I use my long sword analog, this hockey stick, that would be simply addressing the point, flourishing, pivoting out of the way, and coming in from the side. That was me actually being very tight in that movement. I don't know if I'll even remain in shot. So if I do the same here, I'm just simply hitting the point, pretending that's not even important, and I continue the spin until I'm way over here. I had to check the footage to see if I was even in shot there. But one thing you may have noticed is a hole in the back of my hoodie, on the back of my Bible one. That was from an accident in the forge, but that just proves a point. That turns my back to the enemy, and they can simply readjust and get me as well. That still leaves me completely open to a counter-attack. And it doesn't even need to be a fancy one, it just needs to be a straightforward one. So it's either being overly blunt in a refusal to address a point and try and attack in return, or you spin around, exposing yourself, and try to cause damage to the opponent as well. Ultimately, not very good. But, as I proved, you don't need to be flashy in order to be effective. You can simply line up, address the point, and then come in. And you can still be on the defensive here, as you can see. I'm simply seeing the point, addressing it, finding a different perspective, and coming in. Still keeping on my guard. Are there any actual examples of this? Well, first things first, I can demonstrate it with something that I've got another weapon for. That being this, the boomerang. Now, this was certainly a hunting weapon used by the Australian Aborigines, but it was also used across Europe. Many people think, oh, just something you can throw and it will come back. It only is now, but back in the days where it was used as a hunting weapon in Europe, America, Aboriginal Australia, it wasn't meant to come back. It's hard to tell from this angle, but you might be able to see it has a very slight aerofoil shape. Flat on the bottom, slightly curved at the top, tapering to an edge here. That doesn't make for a good attacking weapon, whilst you have enough weight in it and you can put thick edge here, and a thin slicing edge here, you can go for a striker that if someone is happily just out of that range, they'll just get slashed, and then if they're just beyond that range, then it'll be a proper strike again. So a strike, strike, slash, 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 strike again. And indeed you can use it for deflecting and addressing spears, as the Aboriginals certainly had spears. But this wouldn't do that. This is way too thin, way too flimsy. It needs to be a bigger, heavier stick for that. And whilst those sticks certainly had those aerofoil shapes, if there was a sharp edge on it, it would actually mess up the aerofoil. So these are hunting weapons that would be thrown. That aerofoil will create lift, allowing the stick to fly for longer. Nice and low to the ground, so you can get rabbits, quokka, ground-dwelling birds like pheasant. This is a useful weapon, if you know to use it. And it's not mental gymnastics. I think this could be used in warfare. It has been used. Not to throw, bounce off an opponent and fly right back to you. No. It's not like you're throwing your weapon and it's coming back. It wasn't meant to do that. In theory, you could also come at different angles, which will certainly confuse formations, but it still works as a direct weapon. Throw it low to the ground, you think, oh, it's not going to go anywhere, and then suddenly it smacks into your shins. And anyone who has walked into a coffee table knows exactly what shins are meant for. And they'll let you know about it. So, these are weapons of war, and it's not because of fancy ways of changing the way they're used, it's just being big, heavy sticks that you can throw long distances. Never underestimate a boomerang. So that's something practical about using one of these. It's not an over-elaborate way of using a weapon, it's literally straightforwards, but from a different angle, as it were. Are there any arguments that shape up like that online? Well, there was actually one that I did a video on very recently. It was about the donkey of Balaam, who apparently could speak. Well, firstly, the story clearly said that God entered the mouth of the donkey and allowed it to speak. Many people say that's all they need to know because God can do all things and therefore God can make a donkey speak. So if I grab a weapon again, I'm going for that is easy to use in this context. That is again what I like to refer to as a berserker in Lorica. That's just simply saying, yes, true, that's God talking through the donkey. So one can strike. And that's not addressing the point. What else can it be? Well, there could be the fact that there are angels nearby. It could be that he was hallucinating. It could be that all animals spoke back then. I mean, Balaam didn't seem particularly confused about it, but that is mental gymnastics, again, that isn't addressing the point, that is getting out of the way of it and landing another strike. So, is there another way of looking at it? Well, actually there is. Anyone who owns a pet, anyone that owns a dog or a horse, knows that you can talk to animals and they can talk back. Not in the literal sense. I mean, it's very, very unlikely the donkey was actually speaking Hebraic, which was the language they spoke back then. In fact, there's nothing in the Bible to suggest that the donkey was saying much more than any animal can say in just a look. My dog, she's a golden retriever, she once gave me a look that said, are we going for a walk or what? She didn't need to say anything. That wasn't me just putting words in her mouth. I was getting a coat on thinking, I don't know, sugar, it's a bit cold, mate. She just stood there in the doorway giving me the look. And the fact that I was able to put the harness on her, normally she hates the harness, just showed that was what she wanted to say. So, if you remember that Balaam knew that donkey fairly well, so he would easily be able to interpret what the donkey's saying. Just saying it in words that we would understand. That happens a lot. So, that's not me either smashing the point aside. That's not me completely destroying the argument coming at me. That's me addressing the point, seeing it from a different perspective, one I personally know from horses and dogs, and making my point. That isn't mental gymnastics. That's just swordsmanship. Is there any other way? I remember there was something someone was mentioning. Oh yes, it was the disciples only writing down the story 40 years later, when potentially 1,000 people saw the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. He said it's inconceivable that 1,000 people saw it and then go immediately home and write it all down. That, strange enough, is a form of mental gymnastics because it's completely missing a fact of history. That's literally avoiding the point entirely and flourishing away. Seems big, seems fancy. He may think it's straightforward, but no, it's not. It's actually completely ridiculous because literacy back then wasn't well known. Heaven's sake, 2 of the disciples were well known to be illiterate. What was the literacy rate of the people back then? At most 20%. That was the research I did. At most 20%. So even if 1,000 people saw Jesus resurrected, and they all went home, only 200 of them would have been able to write it down. That's how few people could read and write back then. Also, you bear in mind that about 90% of Roman literature at the time, including the provinces, which Israel was one, weren't even preserved for this long, so not after Charlemagne. You can also see that very few of them would have survived. So not only was he failing to address his own point made by other atheists, therefore essentially being a lone man standing out trying to make a point, which was a complete flop, he also failed to address the fact that history isn't all there. It gets destroyed easily. So I think it's super easy to justify Jesus in that sense. Not by mental gymnastics, but by addressing someone else's mental gymnastics. It's very easy to square up to them and land that strike. So, how do we address this and avoid mental gymnastics? Firstly, see the point. Address it, as I did with my screen. See the point, address it. Instead of trying to shoulder barge through it, you simply find it, address it. Then you prepare your own argument. And that can be all down to a simple shift of the line. Shift in perspective, which is often all that is needed. Just shift offline and counter. Same can go for theist versus atheist, or all arguments. So don't just try smashing an opponent's argument. Don't try avoiding it entirely. Address it. Adjust and approach. Whether they accept it or not is down to them. It's how we conduct ourselves in combat that really shows how good we are at it. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll definitely looking to do more of this at some point. But for now, I need to go back indoors and warm up. If your thumbs are particularly warm, try giving it a thumbs up. And definitely subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any uploads like this. Now, I need to go in, warm up, have a cup of tea. Until then, salute.